Is IQ test an accurate way to measure intelligence, or are mental abilities something you can put a number on? Maybe or maybe not. You must have heard it a million times about how Einstein had a genius level IQ of 160. You might also have heard that to join Mensa you need an IQ of at least 130. But today's video is about whether IQ test determines your smartness. So whenever we talk about smartness, intelligence, quotient or IQ is something that you will always hear people talking about. But the question is IQ even a good way to measure your intelligence? Believe it or not, but there's always been a lot of controversies around IQ tests and whether your IQ score is really a measure of something. This test was originally designed by the French psychologist Alfred Binet in the early 1900s. But in the new millennium, is the IQ test still an effective means of measuring general intelligence? Well, according to the general consensus, the answer is no. But first, let's go back in time and understand what led to the design of such a test. So in 1882, aiming at egalitarianism or equality of people, a law was passed which said that any healthy child should go to school to learn basic stuff like reading, writing, history, science and arithmetic. The law included a special consideration for children with disabilities like blindness or deafness, but the French government realized that obviously not every child would be able to keep up with the normal curriculum. So that's when Binet and some other psychologists were commissioned to create a standardized test that would measure how different children handle their schoolwork. Then along with Theodore Simon, Binet came up with another test which would basically ask a lot of questions to different kids until they couldn't answer anymore. This was an exercise to help group like kids with similar scores in a class and identify the ones who needed more help, instead of relying on the subjective judgments of their teachers. 10 years down the lane, the same thing got revised a bit and started getting used for just not kids but also adults. And this was now named as the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scales. It's just a refined form of the same IQ test that is still used today and is meant to measure the learning ability. Earlier versions of this test calculated IQ by dividing your score with your chronological age and multiplying it by 100. And in our modern times and modern versions, what happens is you are just ranked against the other test takers, where 100 is the average and your IQ is determined based on where you are in relation to that average. So now that you kind of know how the whole IQ or the idea of IQ test came up from, let us get back to the initial discussion of whether or not it's a good measure of your intelligence or even smartness. So what we need to understand is that intelligence is nothing but a general cognitive problem-solving skill. And even psychologists believe that intelligence is way more complex than what you can define in just a single number. And that's exactly where an IQ test falls short. A Canadian study came up with how fundamentally flawed our IQ tests are. Human intelligence has three basic indications: your short-term memory, your reasoning skills, and your verbal ability. And sadly, our traditional IQ tests do not completely measure these. The Stanford-Binet test focuses mainly on these categories of info: the baseline knowledge, basic mathematics, visualizing objects in space, working memory, and ability to solve new problems. So depending on what you might be wanting to understand about someone, IQ may or may not be useful for you. But there are various kinds of intelligence as well. For example, the social intelligence, emotional, creative, and acquired skills or intelligence. And these are definitely excluded from the IQ tests. So if you would like to get an idea of your IQ, go ahead and take a test. But just remember that whatever you score, it isn't necessarily going to define how smart you really are.